Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this local review body for the 24th of October 2022. We have a busy agenda this morning, so I'll go straight into introducing my colleagues. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Councillor Bob Braun. I am the convener of the local review body, and I have with me today on my right Councillor Grant Stewart, and to my left Councillor Brian Leishman. We are all members of the Planning and Placemaking Committee, and that's a requirement to sit on this local review body. To my far right is Mr. Ross Burton. Mr. Burton is an independent planning advisor to the LRB. He's not been part of the application today. His involvement only comes about when an application comes to the LRB, so he's independent of our planning department. To my far left is Mr. Jeff Fogg, who is our legal advisor today, and to his left is Jessica Guild, who is our representative from Committee Services. So members, if I may, can I first ask each of you if there are any declarations of interest? Councillor Leishman.
Good morning, convener. No declarations.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, convener. I have no declarations.
Thank you very much. We now move to item 3, which is the approval of the minute. As I was the only member from the previous meeting, I do approve the minutes. They are a true representation. So we will now move on to the agenda itself, and our first item today is number 4.1, which concerns the erection of a hotel in principle at 10 to 12 and 14 South Methven Street, Perth Centre. I can ask Mr. Burton if you would introduce the case for us. Thank you.
Thank you, convener. I'll take you through some, pardon me, a few slides I took of the application site first, and then present a brief report summarising the applicant's case and the report of handling. Start with an overhead shot, an aerial view. You can see the site outlined in red there. It's number 12 is shown on the actual photograph there. It's the one with the dormers front and back. So there's a car park to its north, another building to its south, buildings behind it. It's a town centre location. Next slide, please. The application property, the application site, is the larger 3-storey with dormer building in the foreground there with the blue paint at ground level. The building alongside, the 2-storey building alongside, is as you can see very close to it, adjoining it. The application site though only involves the 3-storey building with the dormers. Next slide, please. As you can see from the picture here, the building is in a very poor state of repair, and it's boarded up. My understanding is it hasn't been in any actual use for some time, and it has had a dangerous buildings notice served on it. Next slide, please. That's looking at the building from slightly further down the street, and it gives you a closer idea of the proximity of the building to the adjacent building, the former cafe. Next slide, please. All right, we're back to the aerial shot. We'll leave that one on the screen while I take you through the rest of my report. So the proposal is for the erection of a hotel, and the site's occupied by a 3-storey building, a building that's got 3 stories at the front, 2-storey at the rear. It and the building alongside, as we saw on the screen there, are both in poor condition. The council has served dangerous building notices as recently as 21st October 2021, when the owner, the applicant, was served with a notice requiring the demolition, but no action has taken place to date. This application proposes the demolition of the 3-storey building and erecting a 4-storey hotel with restaurant bar in its place. The buildings on site have a long and somewhat troubled history, as set out in the report of handling. It's worthy of note that demolition of the buildings on site and replacement with a new building containing flats, a restaurant and a public house was approved in 2007 but never implemented. To summarise the applicant's case, the buildings on site are in poor condition and the best option would be to demolish them and redevelop the site. The buildings will continue to have a negative impact on the appearance of the conservation area as long as they remain. The proposed building design tries to achieve a non-decorative traditional feel to respect neighbouring buildings. The fourth floor is within the roof, which slopes away from the street in order to minimise its massing. The design is intended to complement the surroundings and respect the character and appearance of the conservation area. To summarise the report of handling, a dangerous buildings notice has recently been served on the owner of the site, the applicant, requiring a demolition of all buildings on the site, that is, the application site and the two-storey building adjacent. This notice was served under the Buildings in Scotland Act and has no relevance to the consideration of this application. No detailed information has been submitted to support the demolition, and an application for conservation area consent, which is required for demolition, is proposed in the conservation area, has not been submitted. I understand, however, that a conservation area consent application has now been submitted and is being considered by the planning department. A similar application by the same applicant was revised in 2021, refused, in 2021 because of the lack of justification for demolition, impact of the setting of adjacent listed buildings, lack of an ecological survey, noise survey and flood risk assessment. Policy 28B of the Local Development Plan seeks to ensure that new development preserves or enhances the character and appearance of the conservation area. Also relevant are policies 1A and 1B, placemaking. Scottish planning policy requires that any proposals for demolition of buildings in the conservation area should be accompanied by a detailed application, as is not an application in principle, for the replacement. Guidance from Historic Environment Scotland advises planning authorities that consent to demolish buildings in the conservation area should only be given where there are acceptable proposals for the new building. Should the developer wish to proceed with a proposal on the site, a detailed planning application should be submitted, together with an application for conservation area consent for demolition. These requirements were both identified in the previous application. No public representations were received. To summarise the material considerations, the policies identified in the handling report, 27A, 27B, conservation areas, policies 1A and 1B, placemaking, policy 41, wildlife habitats, and policy 56, noise pollution, in the local development plan are material, as is Scottish planning policy with regard to conservation areas and listed buildings, and Historic Environment Scotland guidance on managing change in conservation areas. Some very brief observations. The buildings on site have been the subject of a dangerous buildings notice under separate legislation. Serving of that notice does not give any permission under the Planning Act for the demolition of the buildings on site without going through due process. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. If I may kick off with some questions, a couple of things. Number 14, that's the not the main building we're talking about, the building next door. My question was, how far back does that stretch? The hotel, or the potential property of hotel, seems to go back quite a way on that plan. It's not very clear on there, I'm afraid, but the so-called quality cafe next door, is that just does that stretch back as far as the hotel, or is that a less of a building? The street scene perhaps might be a bit better, I don't know.
Yeah, well, looking at the aerial photograph that's on the screen there, it appears that the two-storey building projects back at least as far as the back of the three-storey building.
Sorry, and the other question was, looking back at that photograph of the street itself, the architecture along the whole stretch in this conservation area seems to be very different. Presumably all things built at different times, so that there's no consistent architecture across the street. If we go back to the second photograph again.
I think that's right. Could you show the, I think, third photograph in, please?
And the next one, I think, perhaps, was it?
Yeah,
down the street a little bit.
Or even go back to the first photograph, please. I think that shows it looking down the street.
That's the one.
Yeah,
that's the one.
Yes, it is quite different. I mean, there's the traditional sandstone is very apparent. There's a building on the corner, whereas the stone has been painted on both of the buildings that are shown, and nobody's quite. You can't. It's very hard to tell the state of the stone underneath the paintwork, although it seems to be patching, spalling in places, which suggests that it's not in great condition. So yes, and architecturally, you're quite right. It's not as it's a fairly poor architectural quality for the conservation area. I would agree with you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Leishman, any questions?
Thank you, convener. No, I don't.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, convener. I have no questions.
Okay, members. Right. So, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require any more information? Councillor Leishman.
I'm happy to proceed, convener.
And Councillor Stewart.
Happy to proceed, convener.
And I too are happy to go ahead. So, on this instance, perhaps I'll take the lead. Looking through the various paperwork that we have here, it's obvious that the council instructed a structural engineer's report, and subsequent to that, a demolition order was placed on the property, both properties, in fact. And I believe the applicant only is owner of numbers 10 to 12, and number 14 is under separate ownership. But the demolition order covers both, and does make it clear it could be difficult to demolish one without damaging the other, although it does infer that there should be some communication between the two parties, and I'm sure there will be an agreement to do something here. Anyway, from that point, but there's the demolition order anyway, and looking at the various reasons of refusal that we have, and there may just be a time lag here, or it seems to be some sort of disconnect, but the conditions are asking for or stating there's insufficient information to demonstrate that buildings are beyond repair, and obviously we have in front of us the demolition order, so it seems to me that these various conditions are immaterial, to be honest. Now, basic number, conditions 1 and 2 and 3, and I think number 4 as well, and also the question of a biodiversity report to see what species there also seems to be irrelevant now, since there's a demolition order, and public safety must override any biodiversity reports necessary. And I would suspect the only animals living in with the property now are probably rats and mice and any other vermin that can get its way in. My thoughts on this one, since it isn't in principle application, is to go ahead with that as in principle. There are some indicative drawings here of what the proposed hotel would look like. I feel they're satisfactory as far as an in principle decision is concerned. Obviously, there will need to be full planning, and a full design will have to be brought forward for our planners to see. But what we have in front of us, as I say, I think is satisfactory. As we've questioned, the architecture on this area is very varied, and we're never going to get a property in there which is exactly matching what's already there. So my thoughts are to proceed to allow this to go ahead as an in principle, to allow the existing property to be demolished. I think, reading the report, that obviously we would have to ensure that the design passes our planners, that it's also approved by our conservation team. I also note that we would have to have, because it's potentially a hotel, a noise management plan put in place, which would be a condition, would be a standard condition I would suppose. And also, I noted that there was a note here that there should be some form of archaeological investigation on the site before building takes place. So I think that would have to be a condition as well. But generally speaking, my view is that this should proceed in principle. And a building which is dangerous and presumably dangerous to the public should be demolished as soon as possible. That could obviously damage number 14 next door, but I'm sure the various parties would be in agreement to assist each other on this matter. Councillor Leishman, your view.
Thank you, convener. Yes, I agree. I'd be delighted to see the regeneration of the town centre, the boost to the local economy, the job opportunities and the greater choice of restaurants and bars and social venues that it would bring. Not to mention replacing a building that is not only dangerous but also, for want of a better description, a bit of an eyesore and a blight on the landscape of our town centre. With all that being the case, I'm happy to side with the applicant and go ahead with the demolition and the principle. Thank you.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, convener. I will like to go with the applicant. I think we are dealing with a dangerous building, and I think it continues with a theme of a vibrant Perth city centre that is continuing to develop. I agree with the demolition of the building, and I agree with the principle of a hotel, as long as a suitable plan is brought forward, bearing in mind that we're dealing with a unique setting in a conservation area, which my colleagues will review in the future. So yes, I agree with the applicant to demolish.
Thank you, members. So, Mr. Fogg, we have a unanimous support for the applicant on this one. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So, members, we'll now move on to the next paper, which is now paper 4.2, and this involves the erection of a dwelling house in principle again at Sunnybray, Winsole in Auchterarder. So I'll ask Mr. Burton to introduce this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I'll take us through some pictures before I Oh, sorry. Right. This shows it in some more detail. The applicant's house is the one which is to the west of the application site, and you can see there's another two houses in close proximity to the south of the access road. Next slide, please. That is the access road from the main road. It's fairly long. What you're looking at there is the entrance to the access road just before the house with the gable prominent. Next slide, please. This is the access road looking straight down towards the application site. Next slide, please. You can see it's a single track road running between fields. Next slide, please. This is just at the corner of the driveway towards the applicant's house. So one of the houses in the adjacent group is to the left. You can see the White House there. The road goes around to the right. The wall that's on the right-hand side of this picture marks the boundary of the application site. Next slide, please. And the application site is to the right over that fence. The house you see down beyond the private driveway is the applicant's house. Next slide, please. And this is from in front of the gate to the applicant's house. This is looking into the application site. You can see the driveway stretch is on the right-hand side, and at the end of the driveway is the road that the last picture was taken from. Next slide, please. And looking at into the application site from further along the access road, you can see it's grassed, and there's some structures at the closest to the applicant's house, which are chicken coops. Next slide, please. And then this is looking down from just from the corner where the access driveway turns towards the applicant's house. So this gives you a good idea of the extent of the application site. Next slide, please. And these are the structures that are on the site at the moment. As I say, just a couple of chicken coops. Next slide, please. And that's looking at the application site again from further along the access road. It's the postal wire fence is the northern boundary of the application site. Next slide, please. Now I've put this in to demonstrate something that will become apparent in its importance as I go through my report. The application site is shown adjacent to the thick black line, which is this is an excerpt from the local development plan, and the thick black line is the settlement boundary, which so the and E25 is an area for future development. So that's so the committee is aware of the site in relation to the settlement boundary. Next slide, please. And I think if we go into the next one and leave that one on the screen, that would probably be the most helpful one. Right, thank you. So the proposal is to build a 1.5 story detached house on the paddock, located immediately north of a linear group of 3 detached houses near Auchterarder. 3 previous applications for a house on this site have been refused in 2006, 2010 and 2021. This application is a repeat of the 2021 application. The 2006 and 2010 refusals by the council were both appealed, and both were refused by the government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division. The site is a level, open grassed area that currently holds 2 chicken coops at the end closest to the applicant's house. To summarise the applicant's case, the proposed new house would help to meet a shortfall in housing land in the local area. The council's housing land audit 2021 shows a shortfall in the effective housing land supply for the Strathearn housing market area. The council is required to provide to maintain 5 years effective housing land supply, and the audit shows that the Strathearn area has only 4.1 years. The adjacent boundary to the settlement of Auchterarder is virtual in that the immediate area is allocated for employment uses, but no development is programmed. The reality is that the site is associated with a group of houses in the countryside. The proposed site forms an appropriate extension to an existing building group in the countryside and should be assessed under Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside. The first reason for refusal is incorrect. The site is insignificant in terms of extending Auchterarder, and the second reason for refusal is also incorrect, in that it would make a positive contribution to the quality of the area and is therefore in compliance with policies 1A and 1B placemaking. To summarise the report of handling, as the application site is adjacent to the settlement boundary as developed in the local development plan, as defined in the local development plan, Policy 6, settlement boundaries, is the relevant policy. That policy states that development which is located on sites which adjoin a settlement boundary will only be accepted in certain circumstances. If it were not adjoining a settlement boundary, the proposal would stand to be assessed under Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside, but the wording of Policy 6 makes it clear when it states that, and I quote here, proposals adjacent to and out with a settlement which has a defined boundary on LDP2 will be assessed under Policy 6 and not Policy 19. The proposal fails to meet any of the categories under Policy 6 where development would be acceptable. It doesn't involve rural business or diversification. It's not justified under operational need, and no evidence of a shortfall in housing supply has been provided. Public representations, there were none to the application. So to summarise the material considerations, the single most relevant policy relating to this application is Policy 6, Settlement Boundaries, as the site's adjacent to the defined boundary of Auchterarder. The fact that the land within the settlement boundary closest to the application site has not yet been developed is not material. The Strathearn housing market has, as the applicant points out, a shortfall in the required housing supply. This is also a material consideration. Observations on the application. Policy 6 is the most relevant material consideration. If the committee were to take the view that the application complies with this policy, it must then consider the proposal under policies 1A and 1B placemaking. The housing land supply is also a material consideration, although the committee should note that the Council's approved housing land audit 2021, which identifies the shortfall in the Strathearn housing market area, states that, and again I quote from the document, the issue is not one of land allocation, but in the delivery of land in the short to medium term. The audit goes on to say that shortfall figures must be seen in the context of the slowdown in housing completions over the past 2 years. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I don't have any questions, but Councillor Stewart, any questions from you?
Thank you, Convener. Could we go back to a previous slide where there was a hatched areas? I think it was the one with the E25. Thank you. The area H228 is, am I right in thinking that is within the boundary of Orchard development to look at future housing?
I understand that's the case, Councillor, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Leishman.
Thank you, Convener. No, I don't have any further questions.
Thank you, members. So I'll ask you once again, members, can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require any further information? Councillor Stewart.
I'm happy to proceed, Convener.
And Councillor Leishman.
I'm also happy to proceed.
And I too am happy to proceed. So once again, I'll kick off for us today. This case seems to hinge on, to some extent, whether we are looking at policy 19 or policy 6 of the local development plan. It is quite apparent from the LDP that we are looking at policy 6 here. It's quite obvious from the map we're seeing in front of us and the plans within here that this site is right up against the settlement boundary, and it is not a virtual settlement boundary, it is the settlement boundary, which is the policy we must look at. And I have to say that in essence, I can see no real reason why we should move away from the LDP in this matter. It is quite clearly the site where it is. I note in the appeal papers that at one stage the consultant talks about this house has been insignificant in numbers and in development, but then if we're to look at policy 6, it now becomes a significant number for the housing supply in the area. You can't have both, I'm afraid. So my view on this occasion is, and bearing in mind the previous history of the site, is that we should reject the appeal and concur with the planning officer's decision in this case. He does make a good point that if the applicant wishes to change this, he should look at making an appeal on the settlement boundary as and when the next LDP is drawn up. But my view on this one is that we concur with the planning and reject the appeal. Councillor Stewart, may I ask for your consideration?
Thank you, Convener. I would move to reject this appeal and go with the Perth and Kinross officers. Along my view is along with policy 6. It is out with the local development plan, and we have got areas that are highlighted for future development on a planned building basis. Thank you.
And Councillor Leishman.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it's a unanimous rejection, as it's my interpretation that the proposal doesn't meet policy 6 settlement boundaries of the LDP. I don't see any justification to go against the development plan, so I move to reject also.
Thank you, members. Mr. Fogg, we have a unanimous decision again. Fine. Okay, fine. Okay. Thank you, members. We'll now move on to the next paper, which is number 4.3. This is a change of use from agricultural storage building to dwelling house, including alterations, extension and installation of flue. This land is 160 metres northeast of Logie Bray Farm, Craigie, Cluny. Again, Mr. Burton, if you would introduce the case for us.
Thank you, Chair. Take you through the pictures, the slides first. Again, it's a fairly large-scale one because it's out in the countryside. It's just to show the relationship of the application site, which you can see ringed in red there, how close it is to the settlement of Craigie, and the fact that it is very much in the countryside. The next slide shows the aerial position in more detail. You can see that there's a building on site surrounded by made ground, which is being used for various elements of storage, adjacent to the single track driveway, which is leading to it. Next slide, please. So this is the on the track leading to it. The fence, the gate you see on your left-hand side is the access to the site. The site on the opposite side of the road is also owned by the applicant. Next slide, please. That's looking back down the access track towards Craigie, and you can see it's open countryside all around. Next slide, please. And the site, as you can see, rises from the main road. That's the building in the centre of the picture there, which is a kind of triple garage type of storage building at the moment, with some external storage round about it. Next slide, please. You can see the building has well four garage doors, and there's various elements. There's some baled straw to the left-hand side there. Next slide, please. And looking towards the access along the front of the building, and the countryside beyond. Next slide, please. And that's looking towards the back of the building. You can see at some point the building, the hillside, which rises behind the building, has been levelled to provide a level terrace base for this this development, this building. Next slide, please. And that's looking towards Craigie. You can see that there's a fair bit of open storage on the site at the moment. Next slide, please. And looking southwards, I think this is towards open countryside beyond. Next slide, please. And that's looking down back towards the access road. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the proposal is to convert the agricultural storage building you saw in the pictures there into a 3-bedroom house. The storage building is single-storey and contains an implement store and separate feed store. It's situated on an elevated site to the south of an unsurfaced track leading to Logie Brae Farm. It's proposed to retain the building much as it is, with the addition of a single dormer to accommodate a bedroom at first floor level. The applicants graze cattle and sheep on 5 hectares of land they own adjacent to the building and on land they rent. The applicants have commissioned a report by SEC Consulting in support of their proposal. This report was not submitted as part of the planning application, so it hasn't been assessed against policy. The report is to show that the building is to show that the applicant's business requires a presence on site. The report was delayed because of the pandemic and was completed on the day of the council's decision, and its preparation was mentioned in the applicant's supporting statement. The applicants live in Blairgowrie, just over 4 miles from the application site, and the report makes the point that although the estimated labour requirement of the farming activities is 0.23 labour units, living adjacent to the grazing fields would enable a quicker response in case of emergency. The application property is unsightly and the proposals would improve its appearance. The drainage solution proposed, a Clargister plant on land which the applicants own and control on the opposite side of the access track, is capable of dealing with any demands from the council or SEPA and controlling output, including phosphorus, from the house adequately. To summarise the report of handling, the proposal does not directly affect any residential uses and would be able to provide a suitable level of amenity for occupiers. There are no roads issues. The proposal stands to be assessed against Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside. The only category that could apply to this proposal, Category 3, Houses in the Open Countryside, does not apply, as the applicants would have had to submit supporting information demonstrating that the house is essential to the continued operation of a farm for animal welfare reasons. Evidence should be in the form of a business appraisal, which demonstrates that the farm is financially sound and economically viable, and which sets out the required labour hours of a worker, and the operations which require a full-time worker to be on site for the majority of the time. And this is the first reason for refusal. The consent granted in 2009 for the building as an agricultural store contained a condition restricting the installation of any fill drainage arrangements in order to protect the Lunan Valley catchment area, which contains sensitive designations. Any new development in this catchment area must ensure that the total phosphorus discharge does not exceed the current level. The applicant has not demonstrated that the proposed development would protect the catchment area sufficiently, so the application is contrary to Policy 45 of the Local Development Plan, which seeks to protect environmentally sensitive loch catchment areas. Representations. One public representation was received, which does not object, but raises the prospect of the derelict building in the field opposite the application site being converted into a house, or for any further development of that sort to follow. Material considerations, as the report of handling states, policies 19 and 45 are material planning considerations. Some observations on the proposal. Policies 19 and 45 both require the submission of supporting statements giving, in the former case, an economic justification for a worker's dwelling, and in the latter case, technical specifications of the drainage system, which demonstrate that the outfall from the new house does not harm any sensitive area, in this case, the Lunan Valley catchment. A report has been submitted, which purports to be an economic justification for a worker's dwelling, but this report has not been assessed by the planning department. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I only have one question. Looking at the photographs, I just want to clarify, I presume there's nobody living at the property at the moment. There was a picnic table out the front of one photograph, and I look at television area on a pole. I may be wrong, which is saw very quickly, but just to clarify, there's nobody living there at the moment. You're correct about the picnic table that's there. So it looks as if workers, perhaps when they're using it for storage, maybe stop for lunch there, whatever. But there's nobody living there at the moment. It's not a habitable building in those terms. Thank you. Councillor Leishman, any questions?
Thank you, Convener, but no, I don't.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. No, I don't have any questions.
Okay, thank you, members. I think on this case, and you've alluded to it, Mr. Burton, that there is a subsequent report that's coming and arrived after the decision was made by planners, and the planning officer hasn't had a chance to see this. So I'm going to propose that we defer this case for the moment to allow the planning officer to review the report that's come in, justifying on an economic basis why the owner needs to be on site. I think that needs to be assessed by a planner, and also, if I may, perhaps while we're doing that, perhaps ask for the applicants to prepare a report on the phosphorus discharge to see what sort of levels that is to back up their claim that it would be okay. I think there'll be an adequate time for that to be done. So, Mr. Fogg, we're looking for a deferral here for two reasons. One, for the planners to assess the subsequent report that we have for their consideration and decision, and also for an assessment of the phosphorus discharge, as it's a locked Lunan area. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, members, we'll now move on to the next paper, which is number 4.4. And this is relating to the siting of 5 holiday accommodation units, reception building, formation of landscaping and associated works at Waterloo Farm, Waterloo, Bankford. Mr. Burton, again, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. To take you through the pictures first. I'll start with an aerial photograph. Again, it's one from quite far out, just to show you the relationship of the application site, which you can see ringed in red towards the top of the slide there, and Bank Foot. It's very much in the open countryside. Although, as we see from the next picture, there are some buildings round about it. There's a small group of buildings on the other side of the road and on the same side of the road, adjoining the Waterloo farmhouse, which, as you can perhaps tell from the annotation on there, is now a holiday. It is now used as holiday accommodation. Next slide, please. So this is looking at the application site from the main road. The stone building you can see with the two windows in the gable, that is the farmhouse. The access road would be down the side of the field you see in front of you, to the left of the single tree. Next slide, please. And this is looking at the application site itself, looking over the fence from the garden of the farmhouse, and is looking back up towards the roads. The houses you see there are on the opposite side of the main road. So that and yeah, this is as that's where the application site would be accessed from. And the next slide shows the corner of the access road. So the access road would be on the left hand side of this picture, and the application site is on the other side of the fence and to the right. And the next slide, please. And that shows the application site from the corner of the fence. You can see that it's relatively flat, and there are trees on two sides of it, and the fence on the northern side of it is the boundary between the original farmhouse garden and the application site. Next slide, please. The mown grass that you see is the garden of the farmhouse, and the land beyond on the other side of the fence is where the holiday lodges would be located. Next slide, please. And that's looking back towards the farmhouse from the farmhouse garden right by the fence. That's just to show you the proximity of the farmhouse to the application site. Next slide, please. And that's looking towards the buildings surrounding the farmhouse. It's looking towards buildings that are associated with the farmhouse, one of which is also being used as holiday accommodation. Next slide, please. That's looking back at the aerial picture. So 5 holiday lodges and the reception hut are proposed in the open field behind the original farmhouse to Waterloo Farm, a mile north of the village of Bankfoot. The lodges would be timber. 3 would have 1 bedroom, bathroom and kitchen living area, and 2 would have an additional bedroom. The reception hut would have a reception area and a laundry room. The application site is located on the southern edge of a group of 16 houses, which includes the adjacent farmhouse. To summarise the applicant's case, the proposed lodges would allow the expansion of an existing successful tourist accommodation business, which lets out the former farmhouse and the shepherd's hut close to the farmhouse. The high demand for this accommodation suggests the new venture would succeed. While the council's flood prevention team objected on the grounds of potential flood risk, the applicant does not accept that the site is susceptible to flooding. Because of the high cost of a flood risk assessment, the applicant is unwilling to provide it at this stage, but would be happy with a suspensive condition requiring submission at a later date. As with the flood risk assessment, the applicant is unwilling to fund a drainage impact assessment, which is also requested, but would be happy again to submit it later to satisfy a suspensive condition if consent is granted. The applicant is also unwilling to fund a habitat assessment, but again would accept a suspensive condition requiring one. The site of the proposed lodges is at a lower level than the adjacent steading and would be largely screened by it and the trees that border the site to the south. The proposed development is modest in scale and would not look out of place, and it could be contained in the landscape without detriment. The sixth reason for refusal relates to the proposal to provide 2 parking spaces per lodge. The applicant would be happy to accept a condition restricting this to a single space per lodge. The applicant is also unwilling to fund a tree survey and tree constraints route protection plan as requested, but would accept this as a suspensive condition. A list of possible conditions proposed by the applicant is shown on page 265 of the papers before you. To summarise the report of handling, Policy 8 of the Local Development Plan, Rural Business and Diversification is relevant. It confirms that the Council will give favourable consideration to the expansion of an existing business in rural areas, preferably within or adjacent to existing settlements. Sites out with settlements may be acceptable where they could diversify an existing business. Proposals for new tourist-based activities must be justified through a business plan. The proposal meets some of the criteria for Policy 8. It would contribute to the local economy and is close to a bus stop, so would be sustainable, but it would conflict with some criteria. It could, as evidenced by the representations received, have a detrimental effect on residential amenity, and adding 5 holiday lets to the existing predominantly residential grouping would change its character and could be considered incompatible with residential amenity of the adjoining houses. The proposal would result in caravans, pods being situated in an open field with limited landscape containment, contrary to criterion D of the policy, which requires proposals to be accommodated within the landscape setting. And while the proposal relates to an existing holiday business, there are no site-specific qualities which would set the site apart from others, so it fails to meet criterion E of that policy. On balance, therefore, the proposal is considered to be contrary to the requirements of Policy 8. The proposal is also, for the reasons above, considered to be in conflict with Policy 1B, placemaking. While the site is not shown on the SEPA flood map as being susceptible to flooding, the Perth and Kinross flooding team objects to the proposal. Further information in the form of flood risk assessment is requested in order to ensure the site will not be at risk. The flooding team also requests a drainage impact assessment and considers that the proposal requires further information on surface water and fill drainage to ensure it meets the Council's requirements for each. Due to the proximity of the coral burn, there are concerns that the development could impact on ecology, including protected species. An ecological survey is required in line with Policy 41, Biodiversity, of the Local Development Plan. The proposed new access track would be likely to encroach into and adversely affect the root protection area of adjacent trees. Further information is required to ensure that the proposed development complies with policies 40A and 40B of the Local Development Plan, which are forestry, woodland and trees. Representations, 15 letters of representations were received. 1 letter supports the proposal, the others object. Grounds of objection include visual amenity, density, loss of open space, loss of trees, out of character, overlooking, road safety, traffic congestion, light and noise pollution, flood risk, privacy, security, impact on ecology, and on the River Tay Special Area of Conservation. Material considerations. The policies highlighted in the report of handling are all material, as are some of the concerns raised by objectors. Concerns raised by objectors which are not material are overlooking, traffic congestion, privacy and security. Some observations. While it's not mentioned in the reasons for refusal, Policy 8 of the Local Development Plan requires the submission of a business plan with applications for new tourist-based activities, and this has not been submitted. Many of the reasons for refusal could potentially have been overcome if the applicants had submitted the supporting information required: flood risk assessment, drainage impact assessment, ecological study, further details on fill drainage, and a tree tree survey to ensure that the development complies with the policies on forestry and trees. The applicants were unwilling to fund these, however, given the fundamental issue of compatibility with Policy 8 of the Local Development Plan. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. I just have two points. When looking from the road, I approached the road from the south on that picture. My view was that you could only see that development really from that angle. When you're actually into Waterloo, it's all going to be hidden by the existing farmhouse and trees. Would I be right from that? It's purely from that one angle as you come in that you'd actually see it visually.
I do think I think you'd be aware of it across the field as you're travelling from Bankfoot towards Waterloo Farm. But it's a fair distance across the field, and there's a boundary to the field. So you're correct. It's fairly effectively screened by the existing buildings.
And the other one's quite a simple one. The rest of that field, I presume that's all under the ownership of the applicants.
Yes,
and they could extend into that in due course, possibly.
Potentially,
subject to planning, obviously.
I'd imagine you could. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
No questions. Thank you, Convener.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. No questions.
Fine, members. So can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is the information contained within the papers and the presentation of the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Leishman.
I'm happy to carry on.
And Councillor Stewart.
Happy to carry on.
Thank you very much. I too am happy to go ahead on this one. I think this can be dealt with in two parts here when we're looking at the reasons for refusal. This is a full application before us, and I know it's been commented in the appeal papers that we could use suspensive conditions here, but that would be effectively, in my mind, turning this into an in principle application, which I'm not happy to do. We have to assess what we have in front of us, which is a full application. So irrespective of anything else, we are going to have to reject the appeal, or I'll have to reject the appeal. My colleagues will obviously make their own decision based on the lack of information for conditions 1, 2, 3, and 7, all of which need reports. I appreciate there's a cost involved in this, and some of them are quite substantial, but it's my opinion that these are things you have to spend with a full application. All applicants are in the same boat. They have to produce these reports and put them in as part of the application process, and it is necessary to have them. So in essence, I'm going to have to reject the appeal simply on that basis alone, that those reports should have accompanied the application. But there is another part to this, of course, and that is, I suppose, the fact that would this be allowed to proceed? My opinion is that looking at the site, looking at the information we have, that I will be happy for this to go ahead if it comes back. I think that's only fair to say that to people, because I think it's pointless rejecting it, asking for reports, and then it comes back again, and we haven't clarified the situation on refusals, conditions of refusal 4, 5, and 6. And I'm of the feeling that I would delete those. I feel that it's an addition to the existing business. It can be confined to that small area, which I think will complement what's already in existence there without affecting the amenity of the area. There are certain points, however, as has been mentioned, I think when the paperwork does come back, if it comes back, we would need a formal business plan accompanying the other reports. And I would think a condition would be to have a noise impact assessment as well, given that it's a holding location. So my thoughts are we have to reject because we don't have the reports, but I would be happy for it to go ahead, subject to all the other conditions, including the business plan. So Councillor Leishman, your view, please.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I'm happy to hear of a small business looking to improve the local area, and the proposal would certainly offer something attractive and different. And it seems that the applicant already has a track record of running a successful business enterprise. However, there is much more information needed, as you've said. I understand that a small business is trying to keep expenditure and costs down, especially in the difficult economic times that we are currently facing. But certain things need to be undertaken and indeed are non-negotiable. I would therefore have to reject, but I would echo your comments in regard to deletion of 4, 5 and 6, and hopefully we get to see this proposal come to us again, but with much more in-depth detail involved.
Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Again, with the previous application, I'm glad to see that people have got confidence in developing their businesses, and it's something that Perth and Kinross Council would like to support, the continued development of and flourishing businesses within Perth and Kinross. However, after saying that, I feel that assessments and reports are an important part of applications. They're there for a reason, and because we cannot get full information, particularly in 1, 2, 3 and 7, I would reject this application. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we have a unanimous decision again, Mr. Fogg.
Yes. Yes, Convener, thank you. I note the unanimity to maintain the reasons for refusal for the absence of the information referred to in conditions 1, 2, 3 and 7, but that you and your fellow members were not looking to uphold the 4th, 5th and 6th reasons for refusal. There was one slight discrepancy, though. As I understand it, you correctly identified the absence of a supporting business plan, which is a requirement of the rural business diversification, but that doesn't actually seem to be part of what's referred to in the 5th condition. Would you therefore want it to be refused for the existing reasons of 1, 2, 3 and 7, and an additional condition about the absence of a business plan, which is required as part of policy 8?
I think we should have mentioned about the business plan. Yes, I think it's a requirement, so we should have a reason in there for that.
And I also noted what you said about the need for a noise management plan, noise mitigation.
Would that be a normal condition within that?
Can I reflect on that and discuss that with the planning advisor afterwards?
Yes.
Whether that's appropriate for a reason for refusal or could be referred to dealt with an informative. I'm just not immediately sure unless Ross wants to comment now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Burt, would you have any comment on that, Paul?
It would, if committee feels that there is an issue, a potential issue with noise from development, then yes, a noise impact assessment could be a competent requirement, I would think.
I refer to my two members. I would just ask for it just be as normally as a condition of or informative on the plan. If we can do, I would leave it with you, Mr. Fogg, I think, to make a decision on that one. Yeah. Unless my colleagues have any view on that.
The non-compliance with the rural business diversification and the absence of, because of the absence of the business plan.
The business plan should be there, yes. Yeah. Unless my colleagues concur with that. Councillor Leishman, yeah.
Yeah.
Councillor Stewart.
I concur.
Yeah, thank you. Right, with that, members, we'll move on to number 4.5, which is the erection of a dwelling house on land 90 metres southeast of Church Pool Cottage in Aberfeldy. Mr. Burton, if you'd like to introduce for us.
Thank you, Chair. As ever, I'll take you through the pictures first. Start with an aerial picture of it, as it's in the countryside, not close to any to any settlement. I've shown it in relation to Aberfeldy. It's quite a long way. It's 14 miles north of Aberfeldy. You can see it's quite close to the River Tay along that road leading north of Aberfeldy. Next slide, please. And this shows the application site in greater detail. While it's not the best quality aerial picture, you can make out the site in red. It's the The building to the north on the right hand side is the applicant's house, which is accessed by a driveway which runs along the right hand side of the application site. There's a further 3 houses to the left of the application site, which have a separate access just about where the letters A827 are on the slide up there. Next slide, please. So this is at the access to the site, looking back along the main road, and you can see it's open countryside either side of the road. Next slide, please. And this is the access road looking towards the applicant's current house, Comley Bank. The application site is on the left, beyond the post and wire fence. You can see that it rises slightly from the access driveway. Next slide, please. And this is standing on the corner of the application site, just about where on the main road, looking into the site. So you can see that there's no other housing visible from this viewpoint. Next slide, please. Looking further at this is further down the access track with the access. The access to the new house is proposed just about between these 2 trees. You can see on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. There's the current field entrance to the site, looking into the site, and I think you could just make out the roof of one of the buildings in the group nearby. That's not the applicant's house. That's one of the neighbouring houses, which has a separate access off the main road. Next slide, please. And standing at where the access would be to the site, again looking into the site. Next slide, please. This is standing pretty much where the house is proposed. So you're looking down there. The view that you have there is of the applicant's house. The applicant owns the land, and you can just make out on the left-hand side of that slide one of the outbuildings of the other building group to the left. As you can see, the ground falls away downwards towards the adjoining buildings. Next slide, please. And that's looking towards not the applicant's house, I think, but the house of one of the adjoining houses. Next slide, please. Just looking at that's again pretty much from where the house would be sited. So it's just showing the extent of the site, looking towards the access road into the adjacent houses, not the applicant's house at Conley Bank, but the houses on the other side of the site. Next slide, please. And this is looking from where the house is proposed towards the main road. You can see there's a car on the road there. So there are some 3 trees along that boundary, but apart from that, it's quite open. And as you can see, the house is, or the bit of ground that I'm standing on to take the picture is elevated from the road. I think that might be quite a good one to leave on site, on screen rather. If we could go back to that last one, because that just while I run through my report. So the proposal is for a detached house in the countryside, close to a group of 5 houses, 14 miles north of Aberfeldy to the east of the River Tay. The house would have 2 stories with a dining kitchen area, sitting room and study on the ground floor and 3 bedrooms on the upper floor. A large workshop, garage and store is proposed as well. The house would be finished in stone with timber cladding and a metal roof, while the outbuilding would be finished in timber with a metal roof. Access would be taken from the driveway that leads to the applicant's house. The other houses in the group have a separate access. The site is slightly elevated from the main road, as the picture on the screen shows, but it is proposed to carry out some land forming so that the new house would sit at a slightly lower level than the road. So the idea is to provide a lower terrace, if you like, for the house to sit in, to provide some screening from the main road. To summarise the applicant's case, the applicant wants to build a house here because of his personal ties with the area, following an unsuccessful search for a suitable property. The land belongs to the applicant's parents, who live in the adjacent Cumleybank house. The report of handling says that the proposed house would not give rise to any significant impact on local landscape character or visual amenity, and does not raise concerns over residential amenity. The proposed house would constitute an extension of the existing building group into a readily identifiable, defined site. The site is defined by the same boundaries as the adjacent sites, the road and the dismantled railway, which can be seen in the map of the area from 1900, which is actually shown on page 463 of the papers before you. The road and dismantled railway form two sides of a triangle partly enclosing the building group. It is argued that because of this, the proposal conforms with the Council's policy on housing in the countryside and supplementary guidance. To summarise the report of handling, the report falls to be assessed against Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside, and the associated supplementary planning guidance, Housing in the Countryside 2020, and Policies 1A and 1B, Placemaking. The most relevant category of the Housing in the Countryside guidance is 1, Building Groups. Under this category, consent can be granted for houses which would extend an existing group into a definable site formed by existing topography, roads, or well-established landscape features. In this case, there is an existing group of houses, albeit without a distinctive shape or character, with varied accesses. However, it's considered that the proposed plot, around 50 to 60 metres to the southeast of the group, with intervening mature landscaping and rising topography, would be isolated from the main group and visually detached. The proposed plot is also much larger than the existing plots, so the development would not respect the character, scale or form of the existing group. It would appear more as a single house development within a large paddock rather than part of the group. The design of materials proposed and the general layout and massing are all, are all considered acceptable. Although as mentioned above, the plot is larger than any nearby plots. The site is well defined with well-established boundaries that will provide a good level of containment within the wider landscape, and is well screened on approach from the east and west. It's only when passing the site that it will become clearly visible, but even then, the mature trees along the roadside would provide some level of screening. The proposal would not therefore result in any significant impact on the landscape character or visual amenity of the area, and the proposal does not raise any concerns regarding residential amenity. The issue of surface water drainage is of limited concern, and advisory note is proposed if permission were to be granted. The loss of 2 trees as identified in the plans would be acceptable, and a condition regarding tree protection measures from the trees which are to remain would be advised. If permission is granted, a suitable ground contamination condition is recommended, as the site is an area of infilled land. 2 public representations were received, one supporting the application and one objecting. The supporting comment gives the opinion that the proposal is sensitively designed and will fit well into its surroundings. It will create a low carbon footprint and form part of an existing small group of houses. It's noted that it's to be a permanent home for a local couple and their young family who want to remain in the area. The objection relates to surface water drainage. The objector lives nearby and is concerned that the proposed development would exacerbate an existing issue with surface water drainage. To summarise the material considerations, Policy 19, Housing in the Countryside, and its accompanying guidance is the most relevant material consideration. Policies 1A and 1B are also relevant. Some observations on the proposal. The decision hinges on whether the site is or can be seen as part of the group of 5 houses which it will be close to. The ground configuration works proposed, which to see the house sit slightly lower than the current site would suggest, is a relevant consideration when coming to a view on this. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Councillor Stewart, any questions?
Thank you, convener. I was wondering, the area has, it's still on top of a slight rise, and we've got multiple trees, which I note are deciduous. Do you think that would have an impact in overlooking the other properties and the visual impact from the road?
The report of handling points out that there are no concerns over residential amenity, which suggests that that was not considered to be an issue when the report was when the application was assessed.
Thank you.
Councillor Leishman.
No, thank you, convener.
Okay, I just have one question for Mr. Burton. The plan we have of the location of the house is to one side of the field, and I just wonder if there's any information why it's not been put into the centre of the field. Is there any topographical reasons why, or is it just the applicant's view?
I'm not aware of any reasons, councillor. I suspect it might be for proximity to the driveway, but that's just a guess.
Fine, members, then I'll ask again. Can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us? That is the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require any further information? Councillor Stewart.
I'd like to proceed, convener.
And Councillor Leishman.
Yes, I'm happy to proceed also.
And I too are happy to proceed on this one. Looking at the overall view of it, it all hinges on the question of is it within a group? Well, there is a group there, obviously, and having seen the site, concur that obviously there are houses around it. My concern is the distance of the house from the group. It seems quite a distance, and it's an unusual way to put the property in on one side. I would think it would look better perhaps in the middle, and the fact that it's on one side seems to allow a considerable amount of ground that's left, which, as the planning officer mentions, could in future be opened up for further housing development as an infill site. Given that concern and taking into account the planning officer's report of handling, I feel on this occasion, on balance, I'm going to have to reject the appeal and concur with what the planner says, and in both his reasons for refusal, and 1 and 2. It is so far away from the other development of the properties that it in my mind, negates the idea of it being part of a group. And obviously, reason for refusal 2 follows on from that. So on this occasion, my decision is to reject the appeal. Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, convener. I'm heartened to hear that people are wanting to stay in the area. However, I feel I'm going to move to refuse this application on the grounds of particularly point 1.1 building groups, and I have concerns of the countryside in point 2 possible infill site, and as you noted yourself, point 2 moves on from point 1, so I would move to refuse this application.
Thank you, Councillor Leishman.
Thank you, convener. Yes, the plot is considerably larger than what is there already. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that the family are struggling to find a suitable home in the area, especially as there are family ties locally as well. However, I don't believe that the proposal satisfies policy 19, housing in the countryside, so sadly, I'm going to reject the application.
Thank you both. Mr. Fogg, unanimous decision again.
That's clear.
Fine. Thank you very much. So we'll now move on to item 4.6 on our papers today. This is the erection of a dwelling house in principle, land 10 metres west of the Sycamore, Patterson Place in Longforgan. And Mr. Burton, if you'd give us an introduction.
Thank you, Chair. As usual, I'll take you through some photographs of the site first. You can see on the aerial picture there, the site is a narrow one along Patterson Place. It actually is part, or originally was part of the garden of the house to the south, which is at a slight angle, there's now a garage being built at the northern end of what is now used as the garden for that house, which is just over the southern boundary of the application site. Next slide, please. This is looking at the site from Patterson Place. The wooden fencing you can see to this side of the white two-storey house is the edge of the site. Next slide, please. And looking back along Patterson Place, the bins that you see there belong to the adjacent house. So the wooden fence just beyond that is the application site boundary. Next slide, please. And looking directly down to the site, you can see the proximity of the houses on either side, and you can see beyond that the house, which is the applicant's property. That's the house with the dormers and the roof, and the structure you see between that house and the application site is the garage that serves that site, that house rather. Next slide, please. And this is looking into the site. It's very clearly defined. A hedge on one side adjacent to the gable of the house to one side, and a newer fence separating it from the garden of the house on the other side of that fence, and the older fence to the front of the picture is the other boundary. So that's the site in its entirety. I think that might be all the slides. So back to thank you. So the proposal is to build a detached house on this plot. It's for permission in principle, and no indicative floor plans or elevations have been submitted, just a site plan that shows a house that's 7.3 metres wide and 9.9 metres long, with a parking and turning area to the front, capable of accommodating at least 2 cars, and a garden area of 7.5 metres depth to the rear. To summarise the applicant's case, 2 other applications for new houses on similarly sized plots have been granted. The applicant's previous application to divide the garden that used to run from his house on Main Street to Patterson Place was approved. So the first reason for refusal, that the application would result in the loss of linear garden ground, is inappropriate. The second reason for refusal, that the application is in principle, is also inappropriate. If that's the case, the application should not have been accepted by the council in the first place. To summarise the report of handling, the application site is currently part of the garden ground of 79 Main Street. There have been 3 previous applications for a house on the site in 2001, 2002 and 2003, all of which were refused. The 2003 refusal was taken to appeal, which was dismissed by the DPEA. Pre-application advice was not sought. The site is considered to form an important part of the linear narrow garden of 79 Main Street, which is a prominent feature of the character of the area. There are numerous other properties on Main Street which have similar gardens extending to Patterson Place. The presence of linear gardens of this nature therefore forms part of the established character of this part of Longforgan, although it is recognised that some of these have been lost to development. Approval of this new development on this site would be contrary to policies 1A, 1B, 17 and 28A of the local development plan. As the application is in principle, no details of the proposed house are available, so it can't be concluded that development will enhance the conservation area, nor is it possible to assess the impact of the proposed development on adjacent properties. There are no issues with regard to vehicular access or drainage. To summarise representations, 8 public representations have been received, objecting on the grounds of road safety, parking, privacy, overshadowing, visual amenity, contrary to the development plan, flood risk, density, light pollution, loss of open space, impact on conservation area and loss of trees. To summarise the material considerations, the policies outlined in the report of handling are material. 1A and B, placemaking, policy 17, residential areas, and policy 28A, development within a conservation area. Also material is the fact the Council has previously granted permission for other similar developments in the immediate vicinity. Of the objections raised by neighbours, overshadowing and privacy, visual amenity and the impact of on the conservation area are also material, albeit these are considerations which would be expected to be addressed if a detailed application were to be submitted. Observations on the application site has been the subject of a number of previous applications, 3 for a house, which were refused, and more recently for the erection of a fence and garage approved in 2017, which effectively divides the garden into 2. The handling report for the latter application makes reference to the fact that the application would result in the segregation of the rear garden of 79 Main Street, providing a potential plot on the northern side. And that's the application site for this application. The report of handling also refers to pre-application advice, albeit some years previously, that a dwelling house could be accommodated within the northern part of the site, and makes reference to the possibility that a planning application for a house in the new plot would be submitted. That's all, Chair, so happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ms. Burt. Just one question for myself. You talked about a previous view that the plot would or could be a site for a house. I presume that was some years ago prior to the local development plan we now work with.
That's correct. All of the applications, including the applications to subdivide the garden, were previous to the current local development plan.
Thank you very much. Councillor Leishman, any questions?
Thank you, Convener. No questions. Between the papers provided and also a site visit, I was satisfied. Thank you.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. You've asked my questions, so I'm happy to. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know you partially answered this, Councillor Leishman, but I will ask it again. Can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do you require any further information? Councillor Leishman.
Happy to proceed. Thank you.
And Councillor Stewart.
I'd like to proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I too am happy with the information I have. And I too have had a site visit to look at the site myself. There is a history of refusals on this site, and we are in a conservation area, which this land is considered to be an important part of it. I can see no material reasons to change the decision made by the planners on this occasion, nor to change any decisions that previously been made on this site. There's always been a refusal. Having looked at the site, it appears, and the photographs perhaps don't show it quite so well, but quite a narrow site. A house on there would be a tight fit, I believe, which would affect other properties, which must be a thought in mind, and of course will be a situation if it were to come before our conservation team. So to summarise, my opinion is there's no material reason to change the decision that's been made. I would reject the appeal and concur with the decisions and the reasons for refusal as quoted in the decision notice. Councillor Leishman.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, after my visit to the site in Longforgan, I am also minded to refuse the application. The creation of the dwelling house, in my view, would be just too crammed into the site, with subsequent problems of overlooking and overshadowing. That plus it is a busy road, so there is also the added factor of road safety issues as well. They give me concern.
And Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. I can see no reason to step out with the policy conservation area, so I would reject this application. Thank you.
Thank you, members. And we have another unanimous one, Mr. Fogg. I presume that's fine with the conditions. Okay, so we now proceed to the final paper. This is actually a paper coming back to us paper 5.1, which relates to the alterations and extension to a dwelling house, Meadows of Fungarth on Dunkeld. I know I was on the panel which was looking at this one, and my two colleagues weren't. So, Mr. Burton, if you could give us a refresher on this one.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take you through the photographs first. Again, it's a site quite far out in the countryside, so there's a plan, pardon me, an aerial photograph showing its proximity to any other settlement at all. You can see there's not much near it. You can see the red circle around it towards the top of the screen there. It's very much in the deep in the heart of the countryside. Next slide, please. So the site is a cottage which has been there for some time. It's not listed or anything like that, but it's quite secluded from the road. As you'll see, the road is higher than the cottage, and it's effectively shielded from view from passing traffic. Next slide, please. So that's looking down the main road. At the corner there, just below the large tree, is the access to the site. Next slide, please. That's closer to it. You can see the gate on the left-hand side of the picture there. That is adjacent to the access. Next slide, please. And that's taking a picture from the access road, showing the main road and the surrounding countryside. Next slide, please. So moving into the site, the access driveway is you can see leading away from the main road there. Next slide, please. The access turns a corner before it reaches the actual site. Next slide, please. And you can see just the edge of a building in the picture there. So that's after the corner. You can see there's open land to the left-hand side over the post and wire fence that forms the boundary to the application site. Next slide, please. And this is the rear of the cottage, which is, as you can see, is single story, although I understand there's a combination in the roof, which is evidenced by the roof light. It's not suitable accommodation in terms of current building standards, as the ceiling is too low. Next slide, please. And that's the front of the cottage. You can see it's a traditional style of cottage building, not unattractive, and it's and this picture shows fairly well, I think, how the ground rises beyond the cottage, which is where the main road is. So the trees and the rising land effectively screen the cottage from view from the main road. Next slide, please. Looking along the front of the cottage, again towards the main road, you can see a fairly dense bank of trees as the ground rises towards the main road. Next slide, please. And the remainder of the site, looking towards the fence which forms the boundary to the site in front of the cottage, the ground is flat, and you can see beyond that a substantial tree belt, which screens the site effectively from that direction. Next slide, please. Right. Okay, we're back to that now. Because so the committee weren't here for the original. The first time it was presented, I thought it best just to run through the same report again. So the proposal is for a 1.5-storey extension to the cottage located in the woodland off the A923 in a wooded area to the northeast of Dunkeld. The cottage is small with 2 rooms downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs with a very limited headroom. It has the appearance of a traditional stone-built single-storey cottage. Its location within woodland below the level of the road means it can't be seen from the public road. A 1.5-storey building is proposed linked to the existing cottage by a glass link corridor. The ground floor rooms of the cottage would accommodate a bedroom, bathroom and sitting room, and the extension would contain a kitchen, dining room, utility and WC at ground floor, and 2 bedrooms and a bathroom on the upper floor. Because of the limited height of the original cottage, the new element would be higher than the existing building. To summarise the applicant's case, the applicants want to use the cottage as a family home, but the limited headroom upstairs means that the upper floor isn't suitable for use as bedrooms. The headroom is 1.5 metres in the upper floor. The extension has been designed to complement the existing cottage, and the ridge height, while greater than that of the cottage, is no higher than its chimney height. The design is intended to respect the character and design of the original cottage by minimising the intervention of the new element on the old. The height of the new element has been controlled as much as possible in an attempt to respect the appearance and character of the existing cottage while minimising its footprint. The point is made that if the extension were single-storey, it would result in a more sprawling, perhaps over-dominant extension. It's accepted that the proposal is contrary to the Council's design guidance for extensions, but suggests that it's appropriate in this case for the reasons stated and because of the isolated setting, which means that the cottage is, and the extension would be, invisible from the public highway. The details of the existing drainage system are not fully known. The intention is to improve on the existing system by means of a new septic tank or treatment plant. A detailed design will be produced if planning permission is granted. To summarise the report of handling, the proposed extension would far exceed the proportions of the existing house in terms of footprint, more than doubling it, raised eaves and ridge height. The layout would project beyond the principal elevation and rear elevation. The extension would dominate and overwhelm the modest proportions and traditional character of the cottage, making the proposal contrary to the Council's placemaking guides, policies 1A and 1B of the local development plan. This forms the first reason for refusal. The property is located within a woodland area designated ancient woodland. No trees are affected by the proposal. A strong degree of enclosure would remain, and it would be unlikely to have a significant landscape impact. There will be no adverse impacts on residential amenity. No information has been provided on the drainage arrangements, so it has not been demonstrated that the total phosphorus output does not exceed the permitted level, and that there will be no adverse impact on the water environment, and this forms the second reason for refusal. No public representations were received. To summarise the material considerations, policies 1A and 1B-C are correctly identified as material to the proposal in terms of placemaking, and policies 38A, 45A, 53A and 53B are correctly identified as material in terms of the water environment. The immediate environment of the cottage is also material. Some observations: the current cottage is not currently suitable for residential use, as its size means that the upper floor accommodation cannot be used. If it is to be used rather than to be left to become derelict, it has to be extended. What the committee needs to consider is whether this and the specific characteristics of the site, its isolated location, which means that it can't be seen from out with the site, is sufficient to merit setting aside the requirements of the LDP in terms of placemaking. The applicant makes the point that the current drainage system is largely unknown and that the new septic tank or treatment plant will represent an improvement. When the application came before the committee in the first instance some months ago, it was continued for further information on phosphorus discharge. That information has been supplied, but it would appear that it does not show that the proposal would meet the requirements of the local development plan in providing sufficient mitigation. The requirement is to provide more than 100% mitigation, which can't be provided purely within the application site. So it's the view of the planning of the case officer that the application still does not meet the terms of the local development plan in terms of the water environment. Thank you, Chair. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. I don't have any additional questions. Councillor Stewart, any questions?
Thank you, Convener. I have no additional questions.
And Councillor Leishman.
Nor me, convener. Thank you.
Okay, so on that basis, I'll read my piece again. Can we proceed to determine the application for review on the basis of the information before us, that is, the information contained within the papers and the presentation by the planning advisor, or do we require more information? Councillor Stewart.
I'm happy to proceed.
Councillor Leishman.
Also happy to carry on.
Thank you, both. And I'll lead off again on this one. This came before us, as Mr. Burton mentioned, some time ago, and we had to defer for further information on the phosphorus output discharge. Some of that information came back, as Mr. Burton mentioned, and looking at some of the paperwork here, our planning officers have picked up that there is a fault in the information, which they were not happy with. And so on that basis, we still haven't clarified this situation. Prior to our meeting, we did, all of us, receive a fax with some information on it, which, although a copy has gone to the original planning officer, it is not our policy to accept subsequent information in this way. We ask for information. It's a one chance to sort it out, if you wish, which unfortunately there was errors in the calculation. That's a situation we cannot change, and we have to go on what we have before us. The subsequent information that came by fax wasn't presented in the correct way to us. We are an appeal body. We can't look at that sort of information. It needs to go through the appropriate parties first of all. So on that basis, on reason for refusal number 2, we still do not have that information before us at this time in the correct manner, and therefore we'll have to uphold that condition number 2, which was the lack of information regarding drainage and the phosphorus discharge. On the question of reason number 1, which was the design of the property of the proposed extension, this is another matter. As Mr. Burton, I think, alluded to, you could either have, or as the proposal mentions, the extension as is planned, or a further layout with more space to keep it all on one story. The information we have before us, and everybody agrees with, is that the existing property is unsuitable for modern living. My thoughts are that, bearing in mind that the property is totally isolated, surrounded by trees and up a track well away from the main road, I would be of the opinion that the extension is suitable. It is designed for modern living, of course, with a nod to mitigate climate change. There's no way you could, I think, reliably extend the property and keep it in the existing character. The cost will be prohibitive, I think, to even match it in any way. So I'm of the opinion at this stage to delete the reason for refusal number 1, because I feel that the extension is adequate, but I must still reject the paper on condition on reason for refusal 2, that we still have a lack of information regarding phosphorus. I'm sorry about that, but that's the way we have to work. So my thoughts were to the applicants to basically put a new application in with this additional information in place and proceed from there. But so to summarise again, reason for refusal 2 stays. Reason for refusal number 1, I would ask to be removed. But of course, it now goes to my 2 colleagues. So, Councillor Stewart, your view on this?
Thank you, Convener. I'll go to point 2 first, and I would move to refuse this application and go along with the Perth and Kinross Council officers. This is a particularly sensitive area, and with we've got local lochs, drainage. We've got to be very mindful of drainage, and all these lochs interlink. So I think the officers are quite correct here. Point 1, yes, I agree that the present building is probably not suitable for modern living, and it is fully acceptable to have an extension. However, I do feel that we have planning and placemaking guides in place, and whether you can see a building or not, I think these should be adhered to, particularly that the cottage is part of, it's been there for a number of years and part of the historical landscape, and there should be definite links from the old building. So I would like to keep point 1. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart, for that. So, Councillor Leishman, it's over to you. As I warned you, you now have the deciding factor here. We have a split decision at the moment, so it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, convener. Firstly, the drawings are rather impressive, to be honest, but I do believe that the proposed extension is out of proportion with the cottage ultimately doubling in size. And then similarly to an application that we've already previously discussed today, I am, to be honest, dismayed at the information provided. The blunt fact is that the application wasn't executed to a satisfactory degree. As Convener Braun said earlier on, we are given information in the papers provided, and we can garner information from subsequent site visits. But being provided documents at the 11th hour by experts employed by applicants isn't appropriate, really. So I have a really large degree of sympathy for the applicant, as it is clear that the current property is a labour of love for them, and they dearly wish to get it renovated and ultimately live there. And with the appropriate work being undertaken, it would be good to see this again. But I have to refuse the application and concur with Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Councillor. So, Mr. Fogg, we have a slight split decision on the conditions. I think we've agreed that it needs to go back to start again because of the lack of information. But
yes, thank you, convener. I've got that noted that there's unanimity on the applicability of the second reason for refusal, but as you have properly recorded, convener, is a 2-to-1 split, whereas you are dissenting in being minded to remove that first reason for refusal, but the Councillors Leishman and Stewart have moved to retain it. Therefore, that will be the majority decision. Thank you.
right, thank you very much indeed. So that brings us to the end of this morning's local review body. I would like to take the opportunity to thank my 2 colleagues who sat here for the first time, which is why we kept myself as the leading speaker in each case. But I hope they will, if you've enjoyed it, we'll come back again. Thank you to my other colleagues here for their work today. And we will see you all again next month. So thank you very much, and we'll close the meeting.